So our next speaker is Pierre-André Chiappori from still at Columbia, I guess. And Pierre-André is one of the founding fathers of PSC, but everybody has forgotten about that because unfortunately he was discovered by Gary Becker and stolen from PSC at that time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. As Gilles just said, I was here at the beginning, and believe me, it's quite different from what it used to be. I won't tell you how many years ago, but quite a large number. I'm gonna talk about a general research agenda that I've been working on over the last 10 years with a number of co-authors. It's about family economics. But what we try to do in this particular agenda is relate the economics of the family a la Becker, in particular, what's going on within the family, how do we economists think about the family on the one hand, and the impact that those have on matching, and in particular on family formation, whose marries whom, how is the surplus allocated, and ultimately how do those kind of mechanisms influence things like investment in human capital. So that, of course, it's a huge topic. What I will do is I will tell you a very simple story that could explain a few facts that I'm gonna put here, and then I will describe a way of taking that to data, and that will be pretty much it. So, Becker. Why do people live in family as economists? Those are, of course, this is not exhaustive. The kind of thing we as economists can think about. There is consumption of public good, resharing, imperfection of the credit market, and so on and so forth. But the one thing I want to talk about today is domestic production. And you know, domestic production, there is this old story, which is the old Beckerian story, which is there are a bunch of stuff that you need to do, like you need to clean up the house, you need to wash the dishes, and so on and so forth. And so the technology of those kind of chores implies that there should be specialization, that it's efficient that one person specializes in doing this kind of stuff and the other person is the breadwinner and goes on the market. So I will, now this was actually a pretty good. It's never been a very good description, but it was an acceptable description of the situation 50 years ago. I think no one would believe in anything like this now. So an interesting question is what has been changing since then? Can we economists explain this kind of change? And the kind of story I want to tell you is human capital investment, in particular investment in children. It's something that's always been important, but it's much more important now than it used to be. In other words, it's important for a kid to enter life with a good level, a good stock of human capital, but it makes much more of a difference now than it used to 40, 50 years ago. And I think there is no dispute on this point. So what I will argue is that because of this, and because of the fact that the technology of human capital production is very specific, and I will be specific about what I mean by specific technology, there will be changes in investment in human capital, but these go together hand to hand with an increase in assortative matching. Let me talk now about a few facts that are related to those issues. The first one is inequality. One thing that's pretty clear is inequality must be related to matching in the following sense. Take two population, male and female. There is some kind of given inequality between them, and then you match them together, but in two different ways. Either you match them assortatively, the top people together, the bottom people together, or you match them randomly. It's pretty obvious that the first matching will give you much more inequality across households than the second one. Well, that's obvious, but the question is, can we quantify this kind of stuff? It's much trickier than it sounds. One answer was given in a recent paper by Greenwood, Gunner, and co-author, and here is what they say. This is exactly, the statement from their paper. This number here, so the Gini drops from 0.40. So the question is, assume that instead of matching people the way they match now, we match people, given the same marginal distributions, in the way you used to be matched in the 60s. then if you do that, the Gini drops from 0.43 to 0.35. Now, I find those numbers very large. I mean, I don't really believe these numbers. But I think there is a point which is how people match, how sordidly people match must have an impact. But of course, a statement like this raises a bunch of questions. Well, one which is obvious, which is correlation assortative with respect to which trait. Are we talking earnings? Are we talking wages? Are we talking human capital? Quite obviously, we don't want to use earnings because earnings are largely endogenous. You know, earnings is the outcome of labor supply. Labor supply is endogenous decision. Ideally, we would look at matching on human capital, and this is what we're going to talk about. But the key question is this one. When you say we use the 1960 mating patterns and we apply that to the current population, how the hell do you do that? Now, here is the point. If the distribution on the margins were the same, then it will be very easy to do something like this. You have something, you know, you have a matrix, you have people ranked, say, by level of education on the male side, on the female side, count people on the diagonal, and then you play around with this kind of thing. But of course, as I'm going to show you, the main stylized facts of those last 40, 50 years is that the distribution changed big time, in particular on the female side. So the question is, how do you apply the matching pattern to a different marginal distributions? And here, I will argue that you need something like a structural model, which is the kind of thing that I'm going to present. And then, in a deeper sense, why? If there is a change in assortative matching, we do find that there was. Why did it change? Is there something that we could define as preferences for assortativeness? Did this preference for assortativeness change? And why do we expect it to change? Some data. This is borrowed from a paper by Gary Becker and co-authors. So right-hand side of the graph, poor, wealthy country, left-hand side of the graph, poor country. The size of each bar is the percentage of the population with a university degree. Dark blue or black is are men, and light blue are women. And what we see big time is now in developed country, women are more educated than men on average. This is well known, but it's quite spectacular. And even in poor country, we're not yet there, but the trend is pretty clear. I would consider this as one of the most important changes in the last 40, 50 years. I think this kind of stuff, that's my personal view, is more important than the financial crisis of the 2007, because this is long-term. This is structural. This is here to last. Now, let's look at the US. The years here are from 68 to 2006. You look at the percentage of the population with some college, which is the solid line, college, which is dashed line, and more interestingly, a postgraduate. Like this will be low degree, a medicine degree, PhD, whatever, MBAs, and so on. Now, women are in red, men are in blue, and the first thing is we see exactly that women have been overtaking men on each level. Something which is much more interesting is look at the rectangle, the red rectangle here. This is a period in which we know for a fact that the wage premium represented by access to higher education has increased a lot. We know that the difference between entering the labor market with a postgrad degree and with a college degree, it has always been there, but it's much larger than it used to be. We're economists who believe that if the profitability of an investment increases, people should invest more. And we see that big time for women, right? This is like 4%, this is 11%. For men, if anything, we see a decline. So here is the puzzle. You got those people, you face them with exactly the same incentives, and they react in completely different way. How can we explain that? So I'm not going to tell you that I have the explanation, but I'm going to tell you a story that could be part of a possible explanation. Let me come to that. Well, that's not interesting. Okay. In a past paper with Murati Yegun and Yoram Weiss, we offered a kind of, well, it's a story, except that since we're economists, there was a model, but there was no empirical application whatsoever. The model was just there to convince us that the kind of stuff we're telling were internally consistent. So here is the story that we told in that paper. When you invest in human capital, there are two types of benefits. The first one is what you get on the labor market, and this is what everybody has been looking at. And it's there is no doubt. But it's very hard to find a difference between men and women, and definitely you don't find a gender-specific difference that would explain the difference in responses in terms of demand for education of this magnitude. So it's not this, I think, that could explain what we get. But on the other hand, another benefit from investment in human capital is something that you reap on the marriage market. So the point is, depending on your education, the marriage probability is not the same. If you marry, whom you're going to marry, it's not going to be the same. The total surplus that you generate, even for a given spouse, is not the same, and the distribution is not the same. This has changed. The key point is there is absolutely no reason to assume that this has evolved between men and women in a symmetric way, and actually I will give you some raw data that very strongly suggest that they have evolved in completely different ways. They have not been analyzed, not much, but maybe they could explain the puzzle by their influence on investment behavior. That's exactly what we want to look at. But of course, here you need a structural model. It's not so easy to identify the labor market, the college premium on the labor market, because there are very tough selection issues, but at least you got the data. But we don't directly observe the surplus, we don't directly observe the distribution of the surplus, and even those guys, we can observe that. I will show you data on this.
What is the puzzle again?
The puzzle is the return to investment in higher education has increased a lot, and women have responded by increasing a lot their demand for higher education, and men have not responded at all. So there is this huge gender asymmetry in responses. Okay, and the first two, you can see them in the data, but it's not so clear why how to quantify the impact of changes in marriage probability on welfare and therefore on incentive to invest. How important is it that I slightly increase my probability of getting married or to getting married with a more educated person? Now, the paper I want to talk about now, which is the paper with Bernard Salani and Jerome Weiss, here is the more specific story that goes exactly in the same line, but we try to be a bit more specific. We think that the driving force in our story is the increased importance of investment in children's education. Now, be cautious, this is true at the top of the distribution. If you look at recent empirical work on the premium you get from education at the bottom of the distribution, like for instance, what difference does it make being a high school graduate as opposed to a high school dropout? There is not much. Actually, if anything, it might have declined. But at the top, you got this huge increase. So at the top of the distribution, it's much more important than before to invest in your child's human capital. Therefore, we do believe in household production, but we believe that the structure of household production has completely changed. The usual story that you need to wash the dishes, it's less and less important. One reason, by the way, being because there is a technology, there is what Greenwood and others call engines of liberation, that the time you need to spend on this has been decreased a lot. On the other hand, human capital production is more and more crucial. So the main driving force now is human capital production. But the point is the technologies are very different, and now let me be specific about those differences. There are two things that are very specific to the production of human capital. The first one is that the parents' own human capital is an input, and this we know. All the studies from child development tell us that a given investment by an educated parent have a much higher impact on the evolution of the kid than the same time investment or even monetary investment from a less educated person. Whereas it's not clear that you need a PhD to wash the dishes. And the second thing is the parental inputs, they are complements, not substitute. You know, when I wash the dishes, I can do that, my wife can do that, and there is no clear complementarity. But in human capital, it seems to be the case that there is complementarity. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to construct a very simple, almost Mickey Mouse model, taking this kind of thing into account. And we're going to look at standard matching theory, you know, Becker-Beckerian kind of matching theory. We're going to ask ourselves, what does a model like this suggest in terms of the consequences, in terms of assortative matching, and in terms of investment? Okay. What do you need? You want to construct a model, you need two building blocks. First building block, you need a model of household behavior that incorporates the gains from marriage. So marriage is generating a surplus. There are things that you do better, more efficiently, being a couple than you would being single. And in this model, there will be two sources of gain. I will still talk about the chores. I think it's not very important, but they will be in the model. And but the big part of it will be human capital. Once you have a model of what's going on within the household, you want to put this model in a general framework, which will be a matching model. And then you want to explain who marries whom. But more importantly, you want to explain how the surplus is allocated. And the beautiful thing with those matching models is that they can talk about both aspects. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what's the impact of all this on investment in human capital? This is a matching model, so it's frictionless and it's competitive. It's not a search model. And in particular, people in some sense will be price takers. Okay, let me start with what's going on within a household. Men and women match on human capital, so the only thing you need to know about your spouse is the level of human capital. You invest in the child's human capital, and Q is a public good. It will enter both utility, and there is a production function which is very simple. That's the lifetime utility of the kid entering life with a level of human capital Q. It's Q to the alpha. And part of the story will be what we have seen over the last 40 years is a very significant increase in alpha. But I want to capture the fact that it's more important now than in the past to enter life with a large level of human capital. Second thing is the production function. This is the same as in a bunch of papers, including Flynn, Delbo, Witzval, and others. It's Cobb-Douglas. The crucial thing is, first of all, human capital is explicitly there of both spouses. And the second thing is, since it's Cobb-Douglas, the inputs are complements. And
so if you are a single parent, Q equals 0?
No, I mean, we don't have single parents in the model. I'm telling a story, right? If I want to take that to econometrically to data, which we do in other papers, the model will be a bit more complex. So this is, I'm looking at couples.
I don't get alpha. I mean, this is presumably a stupid question, but utility is supposed to be ordinal, so...
No.
I mean, why does it matter that alpha goes up?
This will be a TU model, so utility will definitely not be ordinal. When you have transferable utility, everything is cardinal. Well, let me give you a technical answer. There are lots of cardinalization of the utility, and the one I'm going to use is the one for which I will have the transferable utility property. And here, this is unambiguous.
So basically, it's money, right? It's amounts of money or something like that, right?
No.
It's in monetary terms.
Okay, bear with me.
That way.
It's a standard matching model, so at the end of the day, it's utility. But your TU model, you transfer utility.
Right.
Well, you can tell the story that you're transferring money, but... Okay, chores. I don't want to spend too much time on chores because I don't think it's interesting. So let me just assume that chores is something that takes your time, and the amount of time that they takes is fixed. Like, you need to wash the dishes, and that's a fixed amount of time. What I want to capture is the fact that it takes less time now than it used to. So tau prime is the time spent on chores, and tau is what's left. The point is, it does not depend on human capital. My male and female time are perfect substitute, which means that whomever person has the lower wage will do 100% of the chores. Here we still have the specialization. By the way, as I will show you, in principle, most of the time it should be the woman. There are more couples in the US now where the woman is more educated than the man than the opposite. But, well, we're not exactly there, but we're moving in this direction. You'll see. Now, the preferences, I have the Cobb-Douglas preferences. My Cobb-Douglas preferences, each person has a private consumption, then there is the utility of the kid, which is the public good, and I'm just looking at the product, and I have my Q to the alpha. And there is the budget constraints, which essentially tells me that any time that I'm not spending taking care of the kid, I'm working on the market. So there is no leisure in this model. Well, leisure, there could be leisure, but leisure is fixed. It's not something that you choose. Okay. We have two people, so we need the decision. The decision is very simple. This is a collective model, so we're going to assume efficiency. But of course, this for those of you who are familiar with transferable utility model, this Cobb-Douglas give you a transferable utility model. So in general, an efficient allocation maximizes the weighted sum of utility, but here it maximizes the sum of utility. Of course, for that particular representation, cardinal representation of preferences, which is answering Jim's question. You could take any different cardinalization, but then you wouldn't have the same. The TO property will still be there. Actually, it's an ordinal property, but will be less obvious. Let me put it that way. Now, the cool thing is, at the end of the day, this is the Cobb-Douglas. We have closed form solution for the time spent with the kid. And then we have a closed form solution for this, and that's quite useful because we're going to write a matching model, and this will be the surplus of the matching model. Okay. Let me make a few remarks about the implication of the model so far. I'm interested in telling a story in which some determinants are changing and people respond. So what kind of changes do I have in mind? The first thing is there is more time available for anything but chores. In my model, tau increases. The next thing is alpha increases, so that's really the value of investing in my material and human capital is larger than it used to be. And the last thing is W increase. Now, W is the coefficient that transforms your human capital into a wage. So the fact that people with a higher level of human capital have a higher wage, it's true for the kids, which is the reason why you invest, but it's also true for the parents. And that's very important because it means that if you're at the top of the distribution, the cost, the opportunity cost of taking care of the kid is larger. And not only it's larger, but it increases, and it increases more. So that's the kind of thing you want to put it in the model because in principle it could go in the opposite direction. Now, if you look at what's going on, the prediction of the model are quite similar. This is a Cobb-Douglas utility. So this is, you can give that in the problem set for a first-year student. You expect time spent on children to increase for both parents. You expect the time spent on chores to decrease, but that's what you're assuming. And the time spent increases, especially for the father. That's okay. Now, that's the first building block, the family. Now we need the second building block, which will be the matching model. Let me inflict you a very quick reminder of the general structure of a matching model. How do we think about matching model? Essentially, you got two populations, women and men. So in this model, women and men are defined by just one characteristic, which will be human capital. When I will talk about empirical application, I will put an additional one, which is an observable, because we want to put some kind of an observed heterogeneity. Now, when the formal model is if you take Mrs. X and Mr. Y, and you match them, there is a surplus S of xy, and that's the part of the definition of the problem. And what do you call an allocation? Well, an allocation is if they are matched together, she gets something, he gets something. Now, this is in utility, and there is a resource constraint, which is the sum of what they get cannot be more than the size of the pie that they're producing together. What do we call a matching? The matching, well, yeah, intuitively, the matching is something like take one woman and tell me which man she's going to marry, or whether she's going to remain single. That's not the way you want to put that. In particular, because when I'm saying this, I'm implicitly assuming that if you take a given woman, all women who are identical, who have the same X, will marry the same husband. Now, it's not the case in general. It might well be the case that at the stable equilibrium, identical women randomize. So I definitely want to rule out randomization, so what I call matching is a measure. So essentially, think of this gamma of xy as the probability that at the end of the day, Mrs. X is matched with Mr. Y. And what's the equilibrium concept? Well, it's stability, and stability is the usual thing. What would be unstable would be a situation in which I have Mrs. X and Mr. Y. They are not married together, but they both realize that they would be better off together rather than whatever their current situation is. That's a violation of stability. If you don't have anything like this, you have stability. The point is what you call a matching is not only the measure, but also the allocation, because stability depends not only on who is married to whom, but also how the surplus is distributed. Now, just a remark. Those stuff, U of X and V of Y, it's exactly what I'm interested in. Why? Because when people invest, in that beginning of their life. They're not investing knowing who their future spouse will be, right? They don't even know who their future spouse will be. So what the kind of question they have in mind, the kind of program they have in mind is, how will the utility that we will achieve later in life at the equilibrium of this model be influenced by the investment decision that
sorry, I am just a clarification. So if I get more human capital, I get better married, right?
No, not yet. Depends on the function S.
Equilibrium. Suppose it's the case in equilibrium. Yeah. Then who internalizes this effect?
So
when making investment
you're asking,
decisions?
Is it efficient, right?
No, I'm asking the parents, in their utility function, they have Q, which is just the human capital of the kid. Do I understand correctly?
Yeah.
So I just care about the human capital of the kid. I don't care about how my kid is matched.
No, okay.
Nor do I care about the utility of my kid, or do I?
Think of the Q the Q to the alpha as a reduced form. There are plenty of reasons why the human capital of my kid will be important for him. One is what he will get on the labor market. One is what we get on the matching market.
No, but in my utility function is Q power alpha, where Q is his or her human capital and alpha is an exogenous parameter.
What I'm trying to find out here is whom are you going to marry? Not whom your kid is going to marry.
But in your model, is there in your model the following effect? When people invest in human capital, they are going to invest in more human capital if that leads you to better matches.
They are going to invest more in human capital if their utility at the end of the day increases. Now, the utility they're going to get is endogenous.
If the kid was decided on his human capital, he would say, look, I want more human capital because I get a better spouse.
Yes.
But if it's the parents, and if they only have Q in their utility function, they would say, okay, I maximize my U of Q independently of how that affects my kids' matches.
I suggest we leave that for further discussion. No, but the only thing you need to keep is my utility is increasing. I'm altruistic. I love my kid. I want my kid to be happy, and I realize that the utility of my kid increases in my kid's human capital. There are plenty of mechanisms. One is he will have a better wage. The other one, he will have a better wife or husband or whatever. I'm not entering into a specific modeling of this. I'm doing this reduced form with this Q to the alpha. Okay. Stability. How do you translate stability? The nice thing with this kind of framework is that stability has a very simple translation, which is this inequality here. You take any x of y, it must be the case that what she gets now on the market and what he gets now on the market is at least equal to the surplus that they would generate if they were married. It's obvious, assume that it's not the case. Assume that you have an inequality in the opposite direction. Then it means that A, they are not married, and B, they should be married. They should be married because the size of the cake that they would generate is more than sufficient to give each of them both more than what they have. Okay, now one thing that has been known since at least Chiappori, Shubik, and Becker, actually probably even before since Koopmans and Beckman, is this is not easy. Proving existence of a stable match, it's not an easy problem, and in particular, it's very easy to find apparently simple model in which stable match do not exist. For instance, take exactly this model, but assume that people match within the same population, the so-called roommate matching, then it's easy to generate example in which there is no stable match. So existence is in principle a problem, but here existence is very simple for the following reason. Forget about my stability condition and consider the following problem. You're the dictator. You decide who's marrying whom. You're altruistic, so the only thing you want to do is maximize total surplus. Any couple you create generates a surplus, so when you match everybody, you will create a total surplus and you want to maximize this. Now, the surplus maximization problem is exactly equivalent to stability, and this is actually a very simple mathematical result, which is the following. So the surplus maximization problem is something like you're trying to find a measure on over the product, so you need to define whom marries whom, in order to maximize total surplus, but of course you have constraint, which is the marginals of the measures, because the distribution of men and women aren't given, right? Now, one of the main advantages of this form, and this is the big discovery of Kantorovich, is that it's linear. The unknown H enters linearly the max and enters linearly the constraint on the marginal. Since it's linear programming, first of all, existence is easy to establish, but also you can write the dual, and this is the dual. Now, those are exactly the stability constraints, so the result is a measure is associated with a stable matching if and only if it solves the primary problem. And more importantly, I'm ultimately interested now, let me come back to this kind of stuff. U is how much utility you get ultimately as a function of the human capital that you decide to acquire, right? So at the end of the day, if I want to model investment, that's exactly what I'm interested in. That's the way the surplus is divided. And the way the surplus is divided is determined endogenously by the model. And essentially what this is telling you is U and V, they are determined as the solution to the dual problem. Last thing on matching models. Is it the case that educated people marry educated people? Well, it all depends on the property of the surplus, and in particular, that's also well known, it depends on the supermodularity. Let me just give you an intuition for this kind of stuff. Here is a wrong intuition about matching models. We all like educated women, but since I am myself educated, I have a comparative advantage. So among all the potential mates, the educated women will choose me. And that would give you assortative matching. Now, this is exactly the argument that would be correct in a non-transferable utility framework. Here, there are transfers of utility. Here, I can increase or decrease my utility and decrease or increase the utility of my partner. That's exactly what the TU assumption is about. What does it imply? It implies that at the end of the day, the way you view marriage here is something like a bidding game. It's a kind of strange bidding game because it's a bilateral bidding game. So you got men who are bidding for women, and you have women who are bidding for men. So in principle, I could marry any woman, provided that I'm willing to give her enough in terms of the distribution of the surplus. So of course, it must be the case that the surplus I generate is large enough to allow me to do that. Now, what this means is what? Whether or not educated men will marry educated women does not depend on monotonicity, does not depend on whether we like more educated women than uneducated women. Let's assume we all do. In this model, we all do. But the question is, if I compare my willingness to pay a bit more in terms of utility to get more educated women, how does this amount depend on my own education? Because that's exactly the amount that I'm willing, how far am I willing to go in the bidding game? And that's the driving force, which is the reason why I have the second cross derivative. Now, if you have this, the matching is assortative. So sorry for the kind of technicalities, but we have the theory. We have a Mickey Mouse model. Let's see what the model says. And see, the nice thing. So first of all, the one thing you can easily check, in the model I just described, I had a definition of the surplus. The surplus was this kind of function of human capital of the husband and the wife that was derived from my very simple model of household behavior. The first thing I would need to check is that the second cross derivative of my surplus with respect to his human capital and her human capital is positive. It's the case. And by the way, technically it's the case essentially because the human capital of both the wife and the husband are inputs in the production function. If the production function did not depend on human capital, actually you would get negative assortative matching, which is an important point. But not only this, but I can ask myself, Now let's do my kind of comparative static exercise. You know, I had a change in alpha, I had a change in tau, I had a change in W. What are the impact of those changes on the supermodularity? Because in a sense, when I'm asking, in a model like this, do you expect that when human capital becomes more important, when more time becomes available, when wages, when the wage premium to education go up, do I expect more or less assortative matching? Well, essentially the question is the second derivative, does it increase or decrease with the kind of parameters that I had? You decount the time I spend answering to you, of course, right? So it depends on the sign of those kind of stuff. You do the computation, everything is positive, so this model tells you there should be more assortative matching in the stuff. Okay, especially at the top of the distribution. Now, you take that to data, you need to put a stochastic structure, and now I won't have time at all to talk about this. Let me just tell you two quick things about this. Now, first of all, you don't want to take a model like this as such to the data because the model is just too simplistic. This model tells you this is assortative matching, but you know assortative matching in a very mechanistic way. It tells you the educated men marry educated women, and then slightly less educated women marry slightly less educated women, and so on. So if you take the matrix, education of men, education of women, you will have plenty of zeros. Basically, all the off-diagonal cells will be zero. Not all, because the population exactly, you don't have an exact match, but almost all would be zero. In reality, you look at the data, and we did that on the census, there is no such thing as an empty cell. You do see very educated women whose husband is a high school dropout. You don't see many of them, but you see a few of them. So the way, as applied microeconomists, we deal with this is we put some kind of an observed heterogeneity. So essentially what you're saying is that when you match Mrs. I belonging to education class capital I with Mr. J belonging to education class capital J, there is a deterministic component, this Zij here, which only depends on their education, which is what I'm very much interested in. And then, sorry, there is a random shock, which is everything else, right? Now, you cannot do that in any way. If you do that in clumsy way, it becomes intractable. But you have a model like this, and then this is exactly the same equation as before, except that now I have a t. What we're going to do is look at the evolution of the marriage market over a number of periods. And in a sense, the model is very simple. There is, if you look at the premium generated by two individuals, there is still the fixed component, and there are still the random terms we're reflecting on observed heterogeneity. But this is evolving with time. And I'm very much interested in the evolution of this capital thing. Now, why am I doing all this? Remember that at the beginning I told you, think of a sentence like preferences for assortativeness. Think of this kind of sentence like preference for assortativeness did not change since the 50s. Or the matching patterns that used to prevail in the 60s, I'm trying to apply them. What kind of translation can I give to this? Well, everything goes to the z, so the matching patterns here are driven by the z, so I'm looking at the evolution of the z. And in particular, a sentence like preference for assortativeness did not change over the period does not mean that z doesn't change. It means that the supermodularity of z doesn't change, meaning that the difference, the second cross derivative, does not. So essentially, if you take a model like this, which is the surplus generated, the deterministic part of the surplus generated by the marriage of a woman in education class I and a woman of education class J, there is an education-specific trend on the female side. There is an education-specific trend on the male side, but then there is this stuff that doesn't change. This is a model in which the supermodularity doesn't change, therefore preferences for assortativeness do not change. So now I have a structural definition of this notion. And in addition, I can identify, so as you will see in a minute, assuming that this is constant doesn't work. It has increased a lot, while the micro model predict that it should increase. Remember that all my second cross derivative are increasing, so I expect this to increase, but now I can take it to data. And if they do increase, well, why don't I put a linear trend? I can identify the sign of this coefficient here. So I can tell exactly for which kind of couples it increased and for which kind of couple it decreased. Now, let me give you some data. Now, first prediction of the model, time spent. Here I have the US, Canada, and the UK. Let's look at the US 75, 2003. Those are the standard time use diary. What you find is that these are chores, so that's washing the dishes. The total time has decreased. The total time of women in particular has decreased a lot. The total time by men has increased a little bit, which is exactly what you would expect. Childcare is much more interesting. The time spent on childcare has increased for everyone. Remember, this is a situation in which the opportunity cost of spending time with your children is much larger than it used to be, especially at the top of the distribution. In addition, this is a period in which the family size is smaller. And this is not the time per kid, this is a total time. So despite the fact that the family size is larger, and despite the fact that the opportunity cost of the time is larger, you still see people spending much more time, and for men it's absolutely spectacular, which is what the model predicted, but it's sort of interesting. This is from a paper by a sociologist named Altintas. This is a decomposition. It's not exactly the same time range, but it's a decomposition by educations of the parents, and you see that most of the action is coming from the most educated parent. Again, this is a priori surprising because not only those people have a higher opportunity cost of their time, but they are the people for whom the opportunity cost increases the most. Still, they are also the people for whom the time spent with kids increased most. That's exactly what the model predicts. This one I love, actually. You take all couples in the US and you put them into three categories. Husband and wife have the same education. Husband is more educated, wife is more educated. That's very interesting. The proportion of couples in which husband and wife have the same education does not change much. It increases a little bit, but not much. So you want to quantify the assortative matching just by looking at a number like this. It's extremely confusing. Just because I will show you that our results seem to indicate that there is a very significant increase in assortative matching, but since you have those variations in the composition of the margins, it's not something that you can see easily on an indicator. That's what's cool is that now, if you take the average couple in which the wife, in which they don't have the same education, most of the time the wife is more educated than the husband. Okay, that's about marriage probability. Look at men, that's the year of birth. Here you have a very simple pattern. The more educated, the more likely you are to marry. This is the probability of not being married at the age of 45. So here the story is very simple. The more educated you are, the less likely you are to be single. Now look at women. Forget about the black. Black are a school dropout. It's a bit complex. There is immigration and so on. But on every other education class, for the generation born in 1940, it's exactly the opposite order. The more educated you were, the more likely you were to be single. And this has been reversed. In particular, those people having a PhD used to be a terrible handicap on the marriage market. Well, handicap, it's not a handicap, right? People choose, maximize. But it was very bad news in terms of probability of getting married. And now, actually, you see exactly what the trend is. So what we're moving in, and let me show you a last graph, which is I will conclude on this. I will conclude on this and a policy remark. This is even more interesting. So this is to illustrate this notion that your education influences not only whether you marry, that was the previous graph, but whom you marry. And this has been changing. But remember, the point I'm interested in is this change has been completely asymmetric across genders, because I want to explain why I have these differences in reaction between male and female. Now, you take men born in the 40s, whereas against men born in 70. You put them by education. So these are the high school dropout, these are the college graduates. Of course, they are not the same men, right? And in particular, the size of the cohort, the size of the population in each education category has changed a lot. Now, for each category, you look at the person they marry, and the color gives you the education of the person they marry. So this tells you that if you're a high school dropout, the probability that you marry a wife who has a high school degree is something like 50%. Now, in particular, look at the top of the distribution. What's the probability of marrying up? If you have a college, what's the probability that you're going to marry someone who is even more educated than you? And you see that it increases a lot. Actually, it doubles. Not surprising, right? There are more of those women on the market. But look at what's going on for women. See exactly the opposite pattern. You see that the probability that you're going to marry up has decreased a lot over that period. Now translate that into incentive to invest in human capital. Here is a statement. And by the way, the statement is not by me, it's by Bobby Solo, the wife of Bob Solo. She tried, I was talking with her trying to explain my stuff, and she gave me this summary of my research, which is the best summary of my research I ever heard. I wish I had been able to come with it. In my time, she said it was okay to be a nurse because you had a high probability of marrying a surgeon. Now, the cost of being a nurse is much higher because forget about marrying a surgeon, you have too much competition from female surgeons. You see that big time. So these are the nurses that the probability that they will marry a surgeon, it has been halved. So here we see on the raw data that the impact on the probability of getting married and on whom you marry have been changing in a completely asymmetric way between genders. Now, of course, the rest, the size of the surplus and the distribution of surplus is not something that you observe on the data, but the structural model allows you to compute that. Just these are the coefficients that tell you whether preference for assortativeness increased. What you see is there are 10 coefficients. Most of them are significant. All of them are positive, except one which is not significant. So here the diagnosis is very, very clear. There's been a very significant increase in assortativeness. Well, those are... Let me just conclude, and I want to conclude with the last bullet point, which is what I call the inequality spiral. And you know, I'm not the first one to point this out, but the kind of thing that we found goes exactly in this direction. What we see is a mechanism that exacerbates inequality in the following sense. We have this kind of increased inequality in human capital between individuals. More than before, educated individuals tend to intermarry, which means that the resulting inequality between households is even larger. Now, those households at the top of the distribution in which both the husband and the wife are educated, they tend to spend much more time than everybody else in terms of educating their children, which means that the next generation of people, you will have even more inequality on both sides, and so on and so forth. So what we have here is a spiral that creates a tendency, very strong tendency toward more and more inequality. But see, the problem is this will be very difficult to fight against because it goes in the direction of efficiency. Everything is driven by efficiency. Why is it that the educated parent invests more in their kids? Because the kind of equation we have, and in particular those two facts, the fact that the education of the kid is it depends on the education of the parents, and that the factors tend to be complement, means that everybody benefits from education, but the kids who come with a favorable background benefit even more from education than everybody else. So investing more in their kid, in the sense, it was exactly what efficiency would tell you. So this tells you that if you want to fight that, you will have to fight against economic efficiency, and that's extremely hard to do, except, and that's my last point, except if you act early enough. And one thing we know, and then this has a lot of work in particular by the people at Chicago, Jim Ekman, Flavio Cunha, and others, that show that if you start acting very early in life, like during the 5 years of life, like you take special daycare, in developing countries, Costas Megiro, etc., and Nazio and other people are working on intervention in which they try to teach parents how to interact, especially from very poor background, how to interact with their kids and so on and so forth. And here we can escape this curse of efficiency. Factors tends to be substitutes rather than complements, and the efficiency of those kind of very early intervention seems to be very huge. So we want to fight against this. I think the intervention, we should concentrate a lot of means, much more than we do now, really in intervention at the very early stage of life, because before this kind of mechanism start operating. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes.
Challenge the summary of the research. Isn't it the case that if a woman becomes a surgeon, she's going to end up single?
Sorry?
If a woman becomes surgeon, she's never going to become single?
No. Back in the 50s, yes. But you know, back in the 50s, you're a surgeon. Yes, but if you look at the population born in the 40s, well, the beginning of my discussion with Bobby Solo was, you're a complete counterexample of everything we know about female of your generation, because they were unlikely to have a PhD, you know, for 4%, right? If they had a PhD, they were unlikely to marry. If they were marrying, they were unlikely to have kids, and if they had kids, they were unlikely to continue working. And she did exactly the opposite, which was the beginning of the discussion. But it's no longer the case now. They are just as likely to marry, actually more likely to marry than everybody except college graduated. The fertility, in terms of probability of having a kid, the size of the family is a different stuff, but it's not that different. They tend to work, and so on and so forth. So
I think
go ahead.
Pierre has a question.
Do you have data about matching patterns within same-sex households that they may have lower probability?
So, first of all, this is a very difficult model because same-sex household, you have to be very careful using matching theory. It's not here. You cannot use. You don't have the surplus maximization, so it's not obvious that you get a stable equilibrium. And you have conditions, you need conditions to get. Now, we have a paper with Galisha and Sarani in which we say that we find that this problem may not be that serious, but it's a bit difficult. Now, the only study I know about same-sex household is a study by Sonia Orefice that was published like 7 or 8 years ago. The problem is it's very hard to find to got data set. And because in addition, the ideal thing, you know, this is a kind of very, at the end of the day, we tell a story about what's going on in the household, but we estimate the model using only matching patterns. What we would really like to do is jointly estimate behavior, in particular time spent on children, and matching patterns using all this for the estimation of the model. It's very hard to find a data set even for heterosexual couples because you need panel in which you have time-use data on the panel with a panel dimension. But for a single same-sex household, you take the PSID, for instance. I mean, PSID is too small even for this. But take the PSID, you will have a very small number. And actually, you will not know that.
Okay, Jean-Pierre.
Isn't this a pure American or Anglo-Saxon story? I could expand on a counterexample, I think, which is Switzerland, but I'd like to have you obviously have other data. And the main question, is it dependent on poor public education? Yes. Very strong, that's in line with your last line, and probably poor outside university education, anti-cystic system.
So, the honest answer is, I don't know because I've only studied the US. We have some results on developing countries, but among developed, but this is easy to do on any kind of, I think we have French data to do that and whatever. I mean, you can do that with the census, you may be able to do that with the census. Regarding Switzerland versus the US, I think the driving force here is the low quality of education, but not any education at the very early stage of life. I think that's the driving force. And that's exactly what these kind of models, and the models by Heckman, Cunha, and so on suggest. So to the extent, which I'm certainly willing to believe, that first of all, there is much less inequality in cultural background between the household in Switzerland. Well, you know, you look at the very poor household in the US, and then this I think is a fact. There is much higher quality of very early education in Switzerland for poor people at the bottom of the distribution, that the people in Switzerland, and certainly even in France or Italy, have access at the bottom of the distribution to a much better education system at very early ages, then I would expect things to be much less dramatic in the, and which is exactly, we should emulate what has been going on in daycare, for instance. I'm a big supporter of daycares, not only because it makes women's life much easier, which means that there is this huge amount of human capital that can be put on the market profitably, which is, from an economist's point of view, a very educated woman who doesn't work sounds like a waste. Well, this model tells you it's a bit more complex because she's working also within a household and she's doing something that's productive, but presumably she can do both. But not only that, but in addition, you're helping a lot people coming from a disadvantaged background. And if you want, actually, you should give priority. From the efficiency point of view, the kind of women you want to be on the market being productive are the educated women. So you should give them an advantage in access to daycare. But from an inequality point of view, you should put a lot of emphasis on giving access to daycare to people at the bottom of the distribution, not for the comfort of the parents, but for the benefits to the kids, and especially in the US. I mean, you look at what the inequality at very early age, like at 3-4 years in the US, it's really amazing.